Could the feeling of pleasure or pain, just feeling good or bad, really be the ultimate basis for morality?
Mm-hmm.
For law? Even for deciding who gets a say in who runs the country?
It sounds pretty radical when you put it like that, doesn't it?
It really does. And what happens when you actually try to build an entire political system on, well, basically a mathematical calculation of happiness?
Uh-huh.
Let's unpack this, because that's exactly the kind of profoundly revolutionary question at the heart of our deep dive today. We're plunging into the fascinating and sometimes, frankly, surprising evolution of classical liberalism, specifically in the 19th century.
Right.
We might think we know what liberalism means now, but its roots in this crucial period. They were shaped by ideas so different, so revolutionary, they moved sharply away from centuries of tradition.
And they had to grapple head-on with these completely new, often brutal challenges thrown up by the industrial age.
Exactly.
And what's really key here, something the source material highlights, is that this wasn't just tweaking old ideas. It wasn't just building on Locke, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
No, the thinkers we're looking at fundamentally changed the whole philosophical basis of liberalism. And interestingly, this big shift, it was almost entirely an Anglo thing, mostly happening in Britain after Locke's direct influence sort of faded.
Right. So our mission here, we're diving deep into Brian R. Nelson's Western political thought, really focusing on the sections dissecting classical liberalism.
It's a great source for this.
Definitely. And our goal is to pull out the most important bits of knowledge from this text. We want to pinpoint those core philosophical shifts, get to know the key thinkers who pushed these changes.
Like Bentham and Mill.
Exactly. And explore the absolutely central role they gave to property. Plus, critically, see how the very ideas that built classical liberalism up also started revealing these inherent tensions, problems within the system itself.
Yeah, the cracks start showing.
So the idea is to help you get really well informed about this pivotal era in political thought, maybe uncovering some genuinely surprising turns in how people thought about rights, laws, what even makes a good society.
It's a fascinating period.
Yeah.
And while you had critics, like Edmund Burke, pushing back with conservative arguments,
Sure.
the 19th century really was the age of liberalism, politically, intellectually. But like you said, the philosophical ground underneath it, it shifted dramatically, moved away from those older ideas, like natural law, God-given rights.
And the figure who kind of unintentionally kicked this whole thing off, according to Nelson, wasn't even really seen as a liberal himself.
That's David Hume, lived 1711 to 1776. His impact across philosophy is just huge, but his moral philosophy specifically.
Yeah.
That was the real catalyst, even if indirectly, for what came later in liberal political thought.
Okay, Hume, what was his big insight?
Well, his core insight was really psychological, though Nelson notes it had roots going way back. He basically launched this direct assault on the whole natural law tradition.
So?
He argued pretty forcefully that what we call morally good or bad, it's not based on abstract reason. It's not based on these universal pre-existing truths you discover through logic or God.
No. Then what is it based on?
Sentiment, feeling.
Sentiment? Just feelings? That sounds a bit flimsy.
Well, maybe. But Hume argued it's fundamental. And that sentiment, he said, is simply a reflection of what we find agreeable or disagreeable.
Okay. So if something makes us feel good or, agreeable.
We tend to label it morally good. If it feels disagreeable, morally bad. It's a completely different foundation than finding objective moral laws out there in the universe or handed down by God.
Wow. So moral rules themselves are basically just utilities, things that are useful or agreeable.
That's exactly the connection the source draws. Our moral rules, Hume argued, are essentially utilities. They're good because they're found agreeable, useful for society.
Okay.
Now, there's a nuance here, Nelson points out. Hume's psychology is definitely utilitarian, focusing on pleasure-pain, agreeable, disagreeable feelings. But he didn't necessarily jump to a purely selfish view like, say, Thomas Hobbes.
Right. Hobbes was pretty bleak on human nature.
Yeah. Hume emphasized that our moral sense comes from this capacity for sentiment, and we naturally find agreeable, and thus support, values that help social order. He even argued, as noted in the source, that a key part of this sentiment is benevolence, a natural, agreeable concern for others. He felt that directly contradicted a purely selfish theory.
Okay, so morality comes from feelings, agreeableness, utility, not objective rules. How did that fundamentally challenge the whole natural law idea that had been around for centuries?
It was more than a challenge. Nelson calls it a direct attack. Hume wanted to create a purely naturalistic ethics,
Meaning?
grounded entirely in observable human nature and society. something you could maybe even scientifically validate, like physics. His point was, you just cannot scientifically prove that natural law exists independently of human feelings or social habits.
So natural law is just a feeling we mistake for a fact.
Pretty much. It's a moral sentiment, a feeling that certain rules are useful and agreeable that people mistakenly think is some objective, universal standard floating out there.
And this critique just blows up natural rights and liberty, too.
Absolutely. The argument flows right over natural rights, liberty. These are also moral sentiments for Hume. They exist because they're useful, they're agreeable utilities. There are not pre-existing moral truths given by nature or God.
And not products of some social contract either, like Locke argued.
Nope. Hume dismissed the whole social contract idea too. He said it's not historically accurate, societies didn't form that way, and it doesn't fit with how humans actually behave, based on his psychology of sentiment and utility.
Wow. Okay, just pausing here. That's huge. He's basically taking apart the foundations Locke used for liberalism, natural law, natural rights before government, the social contract based on reason. It's like he pulled the philosophical rug out.
It really was a massive critique, and it left this theoretical gap where the old justifications for liberalism used to be. And that is what paved the way for a new basis for liberalism in the early 19th century.
Yeah.
Which brings us straight to
Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832. The founder, Nelson calls him, of classical liberalism. Distinct from the earlier stuff, he took Hume's criticisms and just built something entirely new on top.
That's the guy. Bentham systematically changed liberalism's whole underpinning, how it justified itself. He consciously, explicitly replaced natural rights and social contract theory with his principle of utility.
Utility uberas.
Pretty much. Though Nelson notes, maybe ironically, that Bentham's version calculating pleasure pain actually sounds closer to Hobbes or later Lockean's focus on self-preservation than Hume's possibly softer version with benevolence. But Hume definitely cleared the path.
Yeah, getting rid of that old natural rights language.
Exactly. Hume performed that critical service. For the utilitarians, that old language was vague, metaphysical, medieval baggage.
And the source says a key thing the utilitarians brought was clarity.
Immense clarity, at least from their viewpoint. Nelson argues they introduced a new level of precision. Before, with someone like Locke, maybe it wasn't totally clear if natural right was some independent moral reason or just naturalistic ethics in disguise.
Ah.
With Bentham, no ambiguity. It's explicitly a naturalistic ethics based on utility, natural right, natural law language, gone from what they considered scientific political talk. Nelson calls it liberation from medieval vocabulary.
So, unlike philosophers just thinking abstractly, these guys were practical reformers first.
That's a huge point Nelson makes. Bentham and his circle weren't armchair philosophers. They were practical guys, focused on real liberal reforms. Their philosophy was a tool.
A tool for what?
To guide their political work, to justify it scientifically.
Right.
Bentham started as a legal reformer. He hated the British legal system, thought it was an incoherent mess.
Right.
He wanted to replace it with a rational system based entirely on his scientific principle of utility. His early work attacked Blackstone, the big legal theorist who relied on old natural law justifications. Bentham wanted calculation instead.
And this calculation, this utility principle, became the foundation for his whole political theory.
Precisely. Though it was James Mill, his disciple, who really drew out all the political implications systematically. But Bentham laid the groundwork in his big book, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation from 1789.
That's the one with the famous line about pain and pleasure.
Yes, the absolute bedrock statement of classical utilitarianism is right there on the first page. Bentham says, and this quote is pivotal, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do as well as to determine what we shall do."
Ought to do and shall do. That's the dual thing you mentioned, psychology and ethics.
Exactly, it covers both. The psychological part is what we shall do, how humans actually behave.
Yeah.
Bentham says we are driven inherently to maximize pleasure, minimize pain. Psychologically, we can't act otherwise. Nelson links it back to Hobbes' egoism, the idea that our will is just the outcome of calculating desires and aversions.
And the ethical part, what we ought to do.
It follows directly. Since that's how we do act, driven by pleasure pain, then logically what we ought to do is recognize this and act accordingly. Ought equals must.
It's a naturalistic ethics then.
Starkly so. Bentham argued any other ethical principle, anything suggesting we should act against seeking pleasure, is false by definition, because scientifically it's impossible. Nelson notes, interestingly, Bentham might have slightly misread Hume here. Hume saw utility describing existing morals. Bentham used it as a universal standard to judge everything. But Bentham was utterly convinced utility was the scientific truth.
So if humans do and should pursue pleasure and avoid pain, what's the government's job? Its whole purpose must flow from this.
Completely. Government's function is derived solely from utility.
Yeah.
Since people want pleasure, happiness, Bentham used them interchangeably like Hobbes,
Right.
then government ought to maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the greatest number possible in society.
Ah, there it is. The greatest happiness of the greatest number. That's Bentham.
That's the utilitarian public interest. But Nelson highlights the radical implications. Unlike, say, Burke's view of society as this complex historical organism.
Yeah, more than just the people alive now.
Right. For Bentham, the public interest is not about some transcendent community. It's defined strictly, solely by the number of individuals. His words. The community's interest is just the sum of the interests of the several members who compose it.
Wow. That is incredibly individualistic. Almost denies community exists beyond a simple head count, like Nelson suggests.
It really does. And that has huge ripple effects later in liberal theory. And notice the built-in majoritarianism. Greatest happiness of the greatest number means the happiness of the biggest majority.
Which links easily to democracy.
Super easily. But it also immediately signaled problems down the road for liberal doctrine, especially around minority rights. How do you protect minorities if the only goal is maximizing the majority's happiness?
Okay, so the goal is max pleasure for the max number, but pleasure, happiness. They seem so subjective. How could Bentham possibly claim to define, let alone calculate this stuff scientifically for government use?
This is Bentham's massive ambition. He claimed he had developed a genuinely scientific, objective way to understand pleasure and pain. He argued pleasure can be quantified, measured, compared based on objective variables.
Quantified pleasure. How on earth do you put a number on a feeling?
Through his famous philosophic calculus, or hedonic calculus, he broke pleasure and pain down.
Into what?
Variables like intensity, how strong, duration, how long, certainty, how likely, propinquity, how soon, fecundity, does it lead to more pleasure, purity, is it mixed with pain, like eating cake is pleasure, but a stomachache later means it wasn't pure.
So you literally add and subtract these things, like a math equation.
That was the idea. For any action, sum up the pleasure values, subtract the pain values. If the net pleasure is positive and higher than any other option, the act is ethically good. If negative, bad.
And for laws affecting lots of people.
Same process, just add one more very extent. The number of people affected. Calculate the net pleasure pain for each person. Then sum it all up for the community. Remembering, the community is just the sum of individuals. The law with the highest total net pleasure for the most people. That's the scientifically correct ethical law.
So Bentham literally reduced ethics, politics, everything to mathematics.
Exactly. He called it a calculus.
Yeah.
But Nelson points out two massive, absolute crucial assumptions you have to make for this to work.
Which are?
1, ethical good is strictly identical to pleasurable. 2, pleasure and pain are strictly quantifiable and comparable between people and experiences, mathematically summable.
And modern liberalism eventually rejects those.
Yes, Nelson foreshadows that.
Oh.
Modern liberalism questions if all pleasures are equal, if they can be quantified, and eventually moves away from utility as the sole basis for ethics.
But Bentham, no doubts, he thought this was real science.
Absolute conviction. He believed he had found a genuine science of ethics, as rigorous as physics. And since it could be applied to the community, he thought he had a science of politics, too, capable of objectively determining the public good. No more fuzzy metaphysics, just evidence-based government.
Sounds powerful, maybe. A little scary. What did this mean for law, for the people making the laws?
Radical implications.
Yeah.
Law wasn't Aristotle's rule of moral reason anymore. It became just a set of man-made rules to control behavior, using pleasure-pain consequences. Criminal law inflicts pain to deter. Law is just artificial consequences.
Just raw, power-shaping behavior.
Pretty much. It's very close to Hobbes's command theory. Law is the sovereign's command, backed by power to reward or punish. Its legitimacy comes from producing good consequences. Max happiness, not inherent justice.
And the legislator, what's their role?
Even more radical. The legislator isn't a wise elder consulting tradition. They're a social scientist using social engineering techniques. Nelson even links this to behavioral psychologists like Skinner, using rewards and punishments.
A social engineer? Using pleasure and pain like buttons to push. That sounds like manipulation.
That's the image. The goal is scientifically restructuring society for the greatest happiness, using predictable responses to pleasure-pain. Nelson contrasts this sharply with Burke's legislator relying on wisdom, prudence, tradition, community sense.
Right.
Bentham's legislator relies on science, rejects the past as irrational error, and since community is just the sum of individuals, there's no community sense to respect. Just cold, hard calculation of aggregate feelings.
Which brings up that massive question Nelson poses. How is giving this power to social engineers to basically manipulate the public for its calculated own good? How is that liberal? Where's the free individual?
Limited government democracy.
That is the crucial question, and critics jumped on it. Nelson acknowledges this tension.
Yeah.
Bentham wasn't even a liberal at first. He favored benevolent despotism. An absolute ruler using his science would be most efficient.
Yeah, and some scholars today look at his social engineer idea and say it sounds more like the modern bureaucratic state, maybe even technocracy, than traditional limited government liberalism.
So why is he a classical liberal founder then?
Because, Nelson explains, once Bentham did become a liberal, mostly convinced by James Mill that reforms needed a democratic structure, he genuinely saw no conflict. He still thought in terms of engineering society for maximum utility, but he came to believe a liberal democratic framework was the best mechanism to ensure the engineers pursued the greatest happiness for the greatest number, not their own interests. So the engineering mindset got folded into his liberalism. It persists as a strand in liberal thought, maybe more obviously in modern state interventionism, but it was there in Bentham.
Okay, so Bentham provides the engine, utility, pleasure pain, the calculus, the engineer legislator. But to turn that engine into an actual political system, a working liberal democracy, he needed help. Enter James Mill.
Exactly.
Yeah.
James Mill, 1773-1836. Bentham's most devoted, rigorous disciple. Absolutely crucial because he's the one who systematically applied Bentham's principles to political structure. And, crucially, he convinced Bentham that his reforms needed a liberal democratic framework to actually happen and stick.
Why did Bentham need convincing? Didn't he think his ideas were just scientifically right?
He did. But, as Nelson dryly notes, Bentham learned what every philosopher learns. Having a great idea, even a scientific one, doesn't mean those in power will use it.
Ah, practical politics.
Exactly. You need leaders willing and able to enact reform. So for the utilitarians, the most vital reform was changing the political structure itself, who gets to make decisions.
And their main target for reform.
Parliament. Specifically, radically expanding the franchise, who gets to vote. The goal was strategic. Smash the political power as a landed aristocracy dominating Parliament.
Why that?
They were seen as blocking modernization, protecting old feudal interests, like grain tariffs, keeping food expensive, instead of embracing things like free trade, which was essential for Britain's booming industrial economy.
So it was old money versus new money, land versus factories?
Pretty much. Britain was industrializing fast. A new, powerful middle class emerged wealth from capital, manufacturing, trade, not inherited land. Their interests lay in modern capitalism.
And the utilitarians were part of this class.
Yes, Mill, Bentham, they belonged to this group, saw it as progressive, rational. So getting the vote for this middle class and eventually some workers was the key strategy. Break the landowners' grip on Parliament. A modern, liberal, democratic state was essential for the economic and social reforms they wanted, all guided by utility.
And James Mill laid out the systematic argument for why representative democracy with a wider franchise was the only way to go based on utility.
Yes, he was the most systematic in using Bentham's utility principle to build the case for liberal democracy. His big work here is the Essay on Government from 1820. He tries to prove, step by step, that representative democracy is the only legitimate government because only it aligns with maximizing the greatest happiness.
And again, it all comes back to that core assumption about property.
Absolutely central,
Yep.
shared by almost all utilitarians and a thread through liberalism since Locke. Property is the main source of pleasure, the main thing people strive for.
So the best government helps people get property.
From that premise, Mill derived his conclusion. The greatest possible happiness of society is attained by ensuring to every man the greatest possible quantity of the produce of his labor. The ideal government maximizes the chance to accumulate property for the most people. Only that, in utilitarian terms, is ethical because it maximizes the main source of pleasure.
But wait, if everyone wants unlimited property, won't they just fight over it, take it from each other?
Yes, exactly. Back to the Hobbes-Locke problem. Unlimited desire plus limited stuff equals war. Property becomes a source of pain, insecurity.
And Mill summed this up neatly, why we need government.
Very concisely, the foundation of government is this. that one human being will desire to render the person and property of another subservient to his pleasures, even if it causes pain to the other person. People will grab for pleasure, property, even if it hurts others. This conflict requires a government strong enough to restrain them.
Okay, government is needed because people are self-interested property grabbers. But the government is made of those same people. Won't they just use government power to grab property for themselves?
Precisely the core problem Mill tackles. A problem inherent in basing everything on self-interest. Government is necessary because of self-interest, but the same utility principle means government officials, a minority, will use power for their pleasure, their advantage.
The sinister interest.
Exactly. Their sinister interest versus the universal interest of the community. They'll abuse power for their own ends, causing pain to the government majority.
So what was Mill's fix for this sinister interest problem? How do you stop the government abusing its power?
His solution, straight from utility, make the government's interest the same as the community's interest. If their interests align, they'll promote the community's good, greatest happiness, not abuse power.
How do you align the interests?
Mill argued it requires government to stop being a minority separate from and potentially opposed to the majority. Because any minority in power, including the government itself, will pursue its own interests unless checked by the majority.
So that's why he dumped monarchy and aristocracy.
Absolutely, they're minorities. Their interests, by utilitarian logic, can't be identical to the communities. He also rejected Aristotle's mixed government idea, thought one group would inevitably dominate anyway. Nelson clarifies Mill saw the British House of Commons as already dominant, so reforming its election was key.
What about direct democracy? Everyone governs. Wouldn't that perfectly align interests?
Theoretically, yes. If the government is the whole community, interests should be identical. Though Nelson reminds us Rousseau had critiques even there. But direct democracy, clearly impractical for big nations like Britain.
So representative democracy is the practical compromise, an elected minority.
Yes, parliamentary representation. An elected minority legislature presumed to have interests close enough to the communities to be trusted, if properly structured. Nelson notes Mill's model. People elect the legislature, which checks the executive government. Ultimate power rests with the people via elections.
But how do you keep the legislators themselves in check beyond just electing them, stop them developing a sinister interest?
Crucial mechanism. Now standard liberal thinking. Limited tenure.
Yeah.
Limits their time to abuse power. More importantly, echoing Locke, limited terms mean they have to go back to being ordinary citizens, subject to the laws they made. The short-term pleasure of misgoverning turns into long-term pain of living under bad laws, aligns their long-term interests with the communities.
Clever. Pure calculation of future pain. But like you said, it all hinges on who gets to choose these representatives, who holds the power to inflict that pain of removal.
Exactly. Nelson calls this more fundamental than even government structure. Mill asks the key question: who the persons are by whom the act of choosing ought to be performed. This is the linchpin. Legislators will ultimately serve the interests of those who can elect or fire them. Only electors inflict the pain of removal.
So the rule for voting must be reject minority representation, just like you reject minority government. The electors must represent the majority interest.
Precisely. Based on utility and aligning interests, Mill then attacks other representation ideas common then. Argued they were scientifically wrong from a utilitarian view because they didn't align elector interests with the whole community.
It's like needing to own property to vote.
Yes. He flatly rejected property qualifications. Argued property owners are a minority, so their interests can't be identical to the whole communities. Their interest in property might clash with non-owners. But, and here's a big inconsistency Nelson flags, Mill does allow excluding the very poorest. Nelson notes, though, that even with this inconsistency, Mill was still way ahead of his time in wanting to slash existing high property requirements.
What about representing specific groups, like classes or professions? Functional representation.
Rejected even more strongly. Some argued these groups could virtually represent, others look after their interests. Burke had a version of this.
But Mill wasn't buying virtual representation.
Not at all, based on utility. He insisted functional groups, landlords, manufacturers, are minorities with distinct, often competing interests. They cannot virtually represent others, especially the majority, because they only reflect their own group interest. Nelson explicitly contrasts this with Burke. Burke's idea might work if you assume a real, transcendent community interest exists beyond self-interest.
But Mill says utility means that kind of shared interest just doesn't exist.
Right. For Mill, given the premise of individual self-interest, that shared community Burke relied on is impossible in the way needed for virtual representation to work ethically.
Okay, so if you rigorously reject minority representation by property and you reject functional or virtual representation, what's the logical, consistent, utilitarian conclusion for who gets to vote?
Logically,
Yeah.
seems like it has to be one person, one vote. Universal suffrage. Direct representation of all competent adults. That's the only way to force the legislature to consider everyone's interests.
This is where Nelson says Mill does an astonishing equivocation. He doesn't go there.
He absolutely does not. It's stunning, given his previous logic. He excludes children, okay? Says their interests are involved in those of their parents. Fine. But then he uses the same reasoning to exclude women. Claims their interests are involved either in that of their fathers or in that of their husbands.
That's seriously.
And he adds young men, too. Their interests are involved with fathers, older males, not independent yet.
So after excluding children, women, and young men, who's left to vote? Who does represent the whole community's interest for Mill?
His conclusion: only males 40 or older should vote. He claims, incredibly, that males over 40 have an interest identical with that of the whole community and may be regarded as the natural representatives of the whole population.
Hold on. That sounds exactly like the virtual representation he just tore apart. How can men over 40 represent everyone, especially women and younger men, when he just argued groups only represent their own interests based on utility? This feels like a massive contradiction.
It absolutely does. Nelson hammers this inconsistency. Mill's final stance looks strikingly like Burke's virtual representation based on shared interest, not direct election, which he just rejected as incompatible with utility. Nelson notes it's not identical to Burke. Mill claims older males' self-interest just happen to align with the community's, rather than assuming a shared community feeling. But the effect is the same, and his reasoning implicitly seems to rely on some shared family group interest that goes beyond strict individual utility, contradicting his core premise.
So how do we explain this? Was it just bowing to the prejudices of his time, political reality?
Nelson suggests a couple of reasons. One is political pragmatism. Maybe Mill thought radical reform needed compromise, that excluding women and young men was necessary to get any expansion of the vote passed, given contemporary views. Nelson argues he was still progressive for his era.
Okay, maybe. But is there a deeper reason? A theoretical one?
Nelson suggests yes, one that reveals a core tension in classical liberalism. The problem arises when you base everything purely on self-interest. Theorists often find they have to sneak back in some idea of community interest or altruism because society just can't function without it.
Right.
Bentham and Hobbes said society's sum of individuals. Mill agrees in theory, but in practice, his franchise argument seems to assume community exists, at least within families or age groups where older males represent others. It highlights the difficulty of building a whole political theory on just isolated, self-interested individuals.
And this struggle, this inconsistency about community and representation is what pushes liberalism towards its modern form.
Precisely. Modern liberalism breaks from this classical view on this point. It explicitly recognizes human sociability, the importance of community, moving beyond justifying the vote only as protecting isolated individual interests. Until then, though, liberals mostly followed Mill, justifying wider suffrage strictly in terms of protecting individuals from sinister interests.
And Mill's inconsistency helps explain why later groups fought so hard for one person, one vote?
Absolutely. Suffragettes, young people demanding the vote. They argued only they could represent their own interests. They didn't trust others, like older males, shared their community of interest on vital issues like war, labor, rights. They demanded direct power to protect their individual interests, ironically, using the very individualistic logic of classical liberalism against its own inconsistent application.
Okay, that's the political theory. Utility, property, representative government with all its wrinkles. But classical liberalism wasn't just politics, was it? It had this twin economic philosophy.
Absolutely intertwined. And the link, no surprise. Property. Politically, property grounds rights in government. Economically, the individual right to acquire and use property freely is the bedrock of a productive economy.
Where did the economic ideas start?
Nelson mentions precursors like the 18th century French physiocrats. They argued against state control, saying economic health comes from individuals freely pursuing property without government interference, the core of laissez faire.
And then the giant, Adam Smith.
Yes, Adam Smith, 1723-1790. the architect of classical economics. His massive work, The Wealth of Nations, published 1776, same year as the U.S. Declaration, Hume's death, provided the foundational defense for classical liberal economics. His argument, laissez-faire capitalism is the ideal system.
Laissez-faire meaning let it be, government hands off.
Exactly. Government doesn't interfere in the free competitive struggle for wealth. Market forces supply and demand set prices, not regulations or tradition. Individuals handle production, consumption, pursuing their own economic self-interest.
And Smith's big arguments for why this works best.
Two huge advantages. First, productivity. Unleashing the desire for property, he argued, generates enormous economic progress, maximum wealth. It encourages initiative, invention, hard work, investment.
And the second?
Self-regulation. The seemingly chaotic market actually regulates itself, guided by an unseen hand. Supply, demand, self-interest, competition. They automatically create rational prices, efficient resource distribution. Competition forces businesses to lower prices, produce more efficiently, all in pursuit of profit. Left alone, it finds equilibrium.
These free market ideas seem almost obvious today in many places, but Nelson says they were truly revolutionary back then.
Absolutely. Nelson stresses how hard it is for us now to grasp how radical Smith was. Capitalism as we know it is modern, really emerging in the 19th century with industrialization. Smith's ideas were the theory justifying these changes.
And comparing it to the medieval world shows just how revolutionary.
The contrast is total. Medieval economy. No free market. Highly regulated by guilds, local custom, religious rules. Guilds set prices, quality wages. The belief was control wealth for a larger public good. Fair prices, just wages, social stability. Selling stuff purely for individual profit. Seemed unnatural, maybe immoral, against community interest.
And the view on self-interest itself was totally opposite.
Fundamentally, deep belief, unleashing self-interest, especially economic greed, was sinful. Making big profits, competing ruthlessly, focusing on getting rich. Viewed with suspicion, condemned by the church. The goal was to constrain self-interest for spiritual and community good, not unleash it.
So Smith's real revolution was changing how the West viewed human nature, especially self-interest.
Exactly. He rejected that self-interest is sinful or opposed to public good. It's just the fact of human nature a primary driver. And his revolutionary point, channeled through a free market, individual self-interest paradoxically creates a larger economic good for everyone, guided by that unseen hand.
So economic self-interest becomes good, virtuous.
In a way, yes. It shifts from sin to social benefit. It's the source of community wealth. That's why Nelson knows Smith and others spoke of enlightened self-interest. Pursuing your own gain rationally inadvertently helps society. That phrase would have baffled, even scandalized, the medieval mind.
And this slots perfectly back into the utilitarian political theory.
Exactly. Nelson connects it. Smith and followers like Ricardo, Malthus were basically economic utilitarians. Shared psychology. Humans driven by self-interest, pleasure, pain. Shared assumption. Property is the main pleasure drive. Shared politics leads to limited government. And negative state, just protecting rights, especially property. Enforcing contracts, letting the economy run itself.
So by the mid-19th century, you get this incredibly potent, self-reinforcing ideology.
Yes. Classical economists plus political utilitarians offered this strong, seemingly scientific defense of liberal ideals, all centered on the right of property as utility or natural liberty. Political and economic ideas boosted each other. Nelson calls it a full-blown ideology. It's key to understanding why, even now, equating capitalism with democracy feels so natural to many.
Okay, we've traced Hume's critique, Bentham's utility science, Mill's representative government via utility and property, Smith's laissez-faire economics. Now, some took these ideas even further, to an extreme edge. Herbert Spencer.
Yes, Herbert Spencer, 1820-1903. A big figure later on, pushing classical liberalism's justification to what Nelson calls disturbing extremes by mixing in evolutionary biology.
Adding Darwin's natural selection to politics and economics.
Precisely. Spencer took the basic idea. Self-interested individuals compete for property. But he added, this struggle is governed by biological natural selection. His argument was stark. Those who fail economically, the poor, the unsuccessful, aren't just unlucky, they're genetically inferior in terms of capitalist survival traits.
Wow, so his conclusion about helping the poor was
absolutely brutal. Government aid, social welfare, fundamentally bad. It interferes with natural selection, keeps unfit elements around, ensures bad traits get passed on, harms the species. Government should stay completely out of social welfare, labor laws, anything helping the unfit.
That's social Darwinism, right?
Yes. Nelson notes Spencer had similar ideas even before Darwin was widely applied this way, but the name social Darwinism stuck. It became hugely popular with some classical liberals. Why? It seems like irrevocable proof from science itself for laissez-faire, individualism, limited government, the negative state, survival of the fittest applied to the economy.
Yeah, he was really popular.
Enormously, especially with the new capitalist and middle classes in Britain and America. His ideas justified their success, we're the fit, and told them not to feel guilty about the poor working class. They're unfit, helping them hurts humanity. Even more than Smith, Spencer made self-interest seem not just beneficial but biologically necessary, and altruism actively harmful. Shows how powerful these liberal capitalist ideas became.
But Spencer today, not exactly required reading in political theory.
No, Nelson says he's generally not taken seriously as a major theorist now. Why? His core biological premise is rejected. Society isn't just biological struggle. Economic success failure is way better explained by sociology, class, education, opportunity, systemic factors, not genetics. His justification for the negative state falls apart.
But the basic idea helping the poor is bad interferes with natural order that hasn't totally vanished.
No. Nelson points out soberingly that while Spencer's theory is discredited in academia, social Darwinist ideas persist. The notion that wealth reflects inherent worth, that aid is counterproductive, it lingers, especially in the U.S., sometimes revived outside mainstream thought, shows the lasting power of that radical individualism from classical liberalism.
Okay, so we've followed this incredible arc. Hume critiques natural law, Bentham builds utility science, Mill applies it to government and property, Smith provides the economic engine, Spencer takes it to biological extremes. But these ideas, especially the laser focus on individual interest in property, started showing serious cracks by the late 19th century.
Absolutely. Nelson shifts here to the growing problems, the contradictions bubbling up from within classical liberal society and thought. Problems big enough to force a rethink.
And the most undeniable practical problem, the biggest crack.
The condition of the impoverished working class, whether property was a natural right or utility, making its acquisition the main game had harsh results, foreshadowed even back in Locke critiques. Laissez-faire plus the Industrial Revolution created this vast, exploited, often brutalized working class. Appalling conditions, no security. Smith's unseen hand wasn't lifting everyone. For many, it was crushing them.
And for liberals who genuinely cared, those liberals of goodwill.
Yes. For those not willing to just shrug and quote Spencer, this poverty was a massive moral and theoretical problem. They found it harder and harder to accept neglecting the poor for abstract property rights or fitness. The human cost demanded a response to fitness. Classical liberalism seemed unable to give.
And another problem came from the very group the utilitarians championed, the middle class, once they got the vote.
Absolutely. A major disappointment. It became clear the newly empowered middle class wasn't using its power to lift society or help the workers. Instead,
They acted like good Benthamites.
exactly. They practiced utilitarianism by maximizing their own class interest, mainly economic advantage, with little regard for a wider public good or the working class.
So the principle they were built on self-interest utility led them to rule selfishly.
Seemed like it. Nelson quotes Ruggiero, "Liberalism had fought the aristocracy, but its actions showed itself attached to its own interest alone." A huge blow for reformers. Figure James Mill. He expected the educated middle class to lead the working class by advice and example once they got the vote. Their example, protecting their own property and class utility, was definitely not what Mill hoped for in terms of civic leadership.
Sounds like this fed a wider sense of self-centeredness.
Critics saw that. As liberal democracies developed on these lines, a kind of narrow, mindless self-centeredness seemed to spread. Majority rule, based on adding up individual utilities, increasingly meant rule by people focused only on their own economic gain or pleasure. Little thought for a broader public good or the community's long-term health.
And what about those still holding on to the ideals? Liberty, reason, public good.
They felt like a shrinking minority, Nelson says, overwhelmed by this politically ignorant and socially unconcerned majority whose politics seemed purely about maximizing their own utility, not civic responsibility.
Which leads straight into that huge problem, majority tyranny. Something usually seen as a danger of democracy, not its goal.
Exactly. Nelson flags this as profound, something early liberals like Locke didn't really anticipate. The paradox. Utilitarian logic plus majority rule seemed to show democracy wasn't just compatible with tyranny, but that extending democracy, a liberal goal, could actually extend the majority's tyranny over minorities, over justice, over progress, all in the name of the greatest happiness defined as just what the majority wants.
So it's these failures, ignoring poverty, the threat of self-interested majority tyranny that force liberalism to evolve into its modern form.
Yes, absolutely. Modern liberalism, Nelson explains, grows directly out of critiquing these classical liberal problems. The working class's plight and majority tyranny. It required rethinking core tenets, radical economic individualism, simple majority rule based on utility. And Nelson stresses, theoretically, majority tyranny was the deeper issue. Even if you fixed poverty or gave workers the vote, liberalism could still fail if they just joined an unenlightened majority crushing liberty and justice. This challenged utility self-interest as enough, setting the stage for the next phase of liberal thought needing a stronger basis for rights, minorities, and the public good than just aggregate pleasure.
So wrapping this deep dive up, we've traced this incredible journey. We saw classical liberalism shift its whole foundation from natural law to Hume's critique and Bentham's utilitarian calculus of pleasure and pain.
Right, building this seemingly scientific system.
Then James Mill applied it to justify representative government, always centered on property.
Yeah.
And Adam Smith provided the economic engine with laissez-faire capitalism, making self-interest a virtue.
Even reaching Spencer's stark biological extremes.
But crucially, we saw how that intense focus on individual interest, property, and adding up utilities, combined with majority rule, created huge problems.
Like grinding poverty for the working class, and that deeply unsettling threat of the majority using democracy just for its own game, potentially crushing minorities and broader ideals.
And understanding this history is so vital because these tensions, individual interests versus common good, government's role, property rights, democracy's dangers, they aren't just history. They are absolutely central to political and economic debates right now everywhere. These ideas still shape our world.
Absolutely. And think about it. If classical liberals truly believe humans are just driven by pleasure pain, and maximizing individual self-interest, especially getting property, automatically creates the greatest good for society as a whole.
Then here's a final thought for you, the listener. What happens within that framework when one person's rational pursuit of pleasure or wealth seems to directly harm the greatest happiness of the greatest number, especially if that greatest number is just an aggregate sum, not a real community? How do you see this clash between individual utility and collective well-being playing out today in debates about inequality, safety nets, market limits, something to definitely chew on after this deep dive?